There are houses in London whose silence seems almost human, places where each creak of timber and flutter of dust feels like a secret half-remembered. In my chronicles of Sherlock Holmes, there are few cases so steeped in unease as the one I have come to call the Whispering Stair, a mystery in which superstition took the shape of sound and terror spoke with a human tongue. It was in the waning weeks of November, when the fog lay thick as wool across the city and the gas lamps burned like tired eyes, that we were summoned, not to a crime of violence, but to a house haunted by a voice, a whisper that rose night after night from the very steps themselves, calling its hearers by name and warning in tones cold as the grave. Blood remembers. What began as a mere curiosity soon uncoiled into something darker, a design as cunning as it was cruel, where fear itself had been built, plank by plank, into the very bones of a London townhouse. There, Holmes would pit the keen edge of logic against a phantom born not of the supernatural, but of sin, greed, and human craft. This, then, is the case I record as Sherlock Holmes and the Whispering Stair. You're listening to Detective Street, where untold mysteries find their voice. And if you enjoy this story, consider subscribing and share in the comments where in the world you're listening from. Chapter 1. A visitor and a whisper. A bleak silver morning had settled over Baker Street, like a shroud of tarnished silk. The fog, that eternal companion of the London winter, pressed against our windows with an almost sentient persistence, transforming the familiar thoroughfare below into a realm of ghostly suggestion. Through that grey veil, the clatter of hooves and the distant cry of street vendors reached us as though from another world entirely. Muffled, uncertain, unreal. Holmes, with his knees drawn up in the armchair, in that peculiar attitude of repose which I had come to recognize as the posture of his deepest concentration, had been reading the agony columns with that singular intensity he reserved for trifles which might grow into cases. The bow of his violin lay idle in his long, nervous fingers, and I noticed that he had not turned a page for some minutes. His grey eyes, sharp as a hawk's even in contemplation, moved across the cramped print with a methodical patience that suggested he was not so much reading as excavating, sifting each desperate appeal for some buried gem of human drama. I, for my part, had been attempting to draft a modest medical article on the treatment of tropical fevers for the Lancet. My pen had grown heavy in my hand, however, and I found my attention wandering to the fire, which crackled and spat in the grate with a comfortable irregularity. The room was warm, almost drowsy, filled with the mingled scents of tobacco smoke, old leather, and that indefinable staleness which accumulates in chambers where books and papers have resided undisturbed for many years. It was into this atmosphere of scholarly lethargy that Mrs. Hudson's timid tap upon the door fell like a stone into still water. "A lady to see you, Mr. Holmes," said she, with that apologetic tone she employed when interrupting what she believed to be important work. "She seems most distressed, sir." Holmes's eyebrows lifted fractionally, the only indication that his interest had been piqued. "Show her up, Mrs. Hudson," said he, unfolding himself from the chair with that peculiar grace which characterized all his movements. He laid aside the newspaper and stood before the fire, his tall, lean figure casting a shadow that seemed to reach across the entire room. The lady whom Mrs. Hudson ushered in was of that class and breeding which announces itself before a word is spoken. Her carriage was erect despite an evident anxiety, and her complexion, though pale, bespoke good health and careful living. She wore a travelling dress of dark grey merino, modest yet perfectly cut, and her gloved hands clutched a small reticule with a tension that spoke volumes. I judged her to be 45, perhaps a year or two more, with dark hair showing the first distinguished threads of silver beneath her bonnet. "Mr. Holmes," said she, her voice steady, though her eyes betrayed the strain beneath. "And Dr. Watson?" "Mrs. Hudson was kind enough to say you might see me without appointment." Holmes bowed slightly, gesturing to the chair I had just vacated. "Lady Eugenia Wyndham, I presume," said he. The lady started visibly, and I confess I felt that familiar thrill of admiration at my friend's powers. She had not, I was quite certain, announced her name to Mrs. Hudson. "How could you possibly?" she began. Holmes smiled that thin, dry smile which was his nearest approach to amusement. "Your visiting card is visible in the top of your reticule, madam, and the coronet upon your handkerchief speaks of title. But these are mere confirmations. The cut of your dress, the particular shade of your gloves, which are sold exclusively by a certain establishment in Bloomsbury, and the faint aroma of beeswax and old oak which clings to your clothing, all suggest a lady of breeding who resides in one of the older houses of that district. There are not above 6 families of title in Bloomsbury at present, and of these only one includes a Lady Eugenia. I have made it my business to know such things." She managed a smile, though it was strained. "You are as singular as they say, Mr. Holmes. Yes, I am Lady Eugenia Wyndham, lately of Wyndham House in Bloomsbury." She paused, and her fingers worked at the clasp of her reticule. "A respectable old residence, Doctor, with a respectable old staircase," she added, and the forced brightness of her tone made the anxiety beneath it all the more evident. "It is the staircase which has brought you to us," said Holmes quietly. It was not a question. Lady Eugenia's composure, which had held admirably thus far, seemed to waver. She drew a breath and looked directly at Holmes with an expression that mingled relief and supplication. "For a fortnight," said she, "we have heard a whisper that runs along the oak steps. Not a draught, Mr. Holmes. I know a draught when I hear one. Not the settling of old timber, though the house is above 2 centuries old, and every beam has its own voice. This is something else entirely. This is words." I felt a peculiar chill despite the warmth of the room. There is something uniquely disturbing about the notion of a house that speaks unbidden, something that touches upon our most primitive fears of the unseen and unknown. "Words," repeated Holmes, leaning forward slightly. "You are quite certain?" "As certain as I am of anything in this world, sir. It calls by name. 2 nights past it spoke to my ward, Miss Alice Fairbrook, as she descended to the drawing-room before supper. She heard it distinctly, her own name whispered from below, as though someone stood at the foot of the stair and called to her in secret. She said it seemed to rise up through the very wood itself. The voice, if voice it was, bade her come down. She fainted upon the landing, Mr. Holmes. When we revived her, she was quite beside herself with terror." Holmes's grey eyes had taken on that peculiar luminosity which indicated his mind was fully engaged, and you yourself have heard it. "Yesterday evening. I was alone upon the upper landing, fastening a window that had come loose in the wind. I heard it distinctly. 3 words that made my blood run cold. She paused, and I saw her hands tremble despite their firm grip upon the reticule. "Blood remembers," it said. "Just that. Blood remembers." "Repeat the phrase, if you please, exactly as you heard it," said Holmes, his voice sharp with concentration. Lady Eugenia closed her eyes, and when she spoke, her voice had dropped to barely above a whisper, as though she feared to summon the thing itself. "Blood remembers," said she, and I saw a visible shiver pass through her frame. The voice seemed to rise from the lower flight, Mr. Holmes, seemed to crawl up the steps like something alive. Holmes was silent for a moment, his fingertips pressed together in that characteristic gesture I knew so well. Then he straightened. "You have brought something to show me." With a delicacy which did her credit, Lady Eugenia opened her reticule and produced 3 small objects, which she placed upon the side table with evident reluctance, as though touching them pained her. I rose from my position by the window to examine them more closely. The first was a charred vesta, a common match, but there was something unusual about it. Even from where I stood, I could detect a curious resinous odor, sweet and somehow unpleasant, quite unlike the ordinary sulphur smell of spent matches. The second object was a cork, cylindrical and perhaps an inch in length, which had been pierced clean through its center by some sharp instrument. The hole was perfectly round and smooth, as though made by a drill rather than a nail or awl. The third item was the head of a tiny brass screw, no larger than a button, which gleamed with unusual brightness, as if newly cut or recently cleaned. These I found upon or under the stair within the week, Lady Eugenia said, her voice steadier now that she had concrete evidence to present. "They mean nothing to me, but I hoped they might signify something to you." Holmes had taken up the cork and was examining it with that intense scrutiny he brought to all physical evidence. He held it to the light, turned it in his fingers, and then, to my surprise, lifted it to his nose and inhaled deeply. His nostrils dilated slightly. "India rubber and peppermint," he murmured, so softly that I barely caught the words. He set the cork down and took up the vesta, subjecting it to the same careful examination. The screw he barely glanced at, but I noticed his eyes lingered upon it with a peculiar intensity before he set it down again. "Lady Eugenia," said Holmes, straightening and fixing her with that penetrating gaze which so many found disconcerting. "These objects are indeed significant, but before we proceed further, I must know something of your household. Who resides at Wyndham House besides yourself and your ward?" "My cousin, Mr. Lionel Wyndham, who is Sir Peregrine's nephew. He has lived with us these 2 years past. Then there is Mr. Palfrey, our steward, a most reliable man who has been with the family for above 20 years. We keep but small staff, a housemaid, a cook, and a boy who comes in for the heavy work. And of course Miss Fairbrook, who is not truly my ward in the legal sense, but the orphaned daughter of an old friend. She has been with us 3 years now." "No other residents?" Holmes inquired. "There is also the Reverend Mr. Morley, who is not a resident, but a frequent caller. He takes an interest in Miss Fairbrook's studies. She reads philosophy and theology with him. A very earnest young man, though perhaps too given to enthusiasm." Holmes was silent for a moment, that distant look upon his face which told me his mind was already ranging through possibilities, constructing and discarding theories with a rapidity I could never hope to match. "You mentioned Sir Peregrine," said he at length. "He is no longer living." A shadow passed across Lady Eugenia's face. "My late brother-in-law. He fell upon those very steps last year. Last November it was, and struck his temple against the newel post. The doctor said he died almost instantly. An accident, they said. A tragic accident. But now—" She could not finish the sentence. Holmes let the pierced cork balance upon his long forefinger, watching it with an abstraction that might have seemed callous to one who did not know him. "There are whispers that begin with wind," he murmured, as though speaking to himself, "and others that begin with men." He looked up suddenly, and his manner became brisk, almost businesslike. "Pray allow me until tonight, Lady Eugenia. I shall need to examine the house itself, and the staircase in particular. Watson, our hats!" I remember with perfect clarity the slight narrowing of Holmes's eyes as he lifted the cork to his nose one final time before setting it down. "India rubber and peppermint," he said softly, meeting my gaze with an expression I could not quite read. He declined to elaborate, but I had learned by then that a small scent, like a small clue, should be permitted to ripen in silence before one plucked it. Lady Eugenia rose, and some of the tension seemed to have left her shoulders. "You give me hope, Mr. Holmes. I confess I half feared that you would dismiss my concerns as mere fancy." "I never dismiss what can be demonstrated, madam," said Holmes quietly. "A whisper is as real as a shout, and often more dangerous. I shall call upon you at 3 o'clock this afternoon, if that is convenient. And Lady Eugenia—" He paused as she reached the door. "Until I have examined the premises, I would strongly advise that neither you nor Miss Fairbrook use the staircase after dark. Are there other means of moving between floors? There is a servants' stair at the rear. Then use it. And speak of our meeting to no one, not even your cousin or your steward. I find that problems have a way of solving themselves when those involved believe they are unobserved." When she had gone, accompanied by Mrs. Hudson's solicitous murmurs, I turned to find Holmes standing motionless before the fire, his hands clasped behind his back, staring into the flames with that intensity which indicated he was already far away in thought. "Well, Holmes," said I, breaking the silence which had grown almost oppressive, "what do you make of it? Is there truly something supernatural about this business, or—" He turned to me with something approaching impatience. "Come, Watson, you know better than that. There is nothing supernatural in this world save human nature itself, which is inexhaustible in its capacity for self-deception. No, what we have here is something far more interesting than a ghost. We have theatre, Watson. We have stagecraft. We have someone who understands that the human ear, like the human eye, can be made to perceive what is not there. Then you believe the whisper is manufactured?" "I believe," said Holmes, reaching for his pipe, "that a whisper which speaks words is no whisper at all, but a voice disguised. And voices, Watson, do not rise through oak of their own accord. They require a speaker, and speakers require motive, means, and opportunity." That morning's quiet had been pierced like a bubble. In the measured way of our lives, a new problem had already begun to climb our own familiar stairs. I watched Holmes as he filled his pipe with that black shag tobacco he preferred, his long fingers moving with automatic precision. And I knew that whatever mysteries Wyndham House concealed, they would not remain concealed for long. Outside, the fog pressed close against our windows, and somewhere in its grey depths London pursued its endless business, unconscious, as always, of the small dramas that played out in its ancient houses, the whispers that climbed its stairs, and the fears that haunted its nights. Chapter 2. Oak dust and the first footprints, the journey to Bloomsbury through that cold afternoon, remains vivid in my memory. Holmes had said little since Lady Eugenia's departure, but I could see by the set of his jaw and the restless movements of his hands that his mind was working with that peculiar intensity which presaged action. We took a hansom through streets made mysterious by the persistent fog, and I recall watching the gas lamps bloom into being one by one as the winter dusk came early, turning the city into a kingdom of yellow halos floating in grey obscurity. Wyndham House proved to be one of those tall, sober dwellings wedged like books upon a crowded shelf just off Bedford Square, a district which had seen better days but maintained its dignity through sheer architectural stubbornness. The house was of dark brick, 4 stories tall, with narrow windows that stared out at the world with a kind of austere disapproval. A small iron fence separated it from the pavement, and the few steps leading to the front door were worn smooth by generations of feet. Lady Eugenia herself admitted us, and I noted with approval that she had taken Holmes's advice to heart. No servant appeared to announce our arrival, and she led us directly into the front hall with a conspiratorial silence that would have been amusing in other circumstances. The pride of the place was immediately evident. The oak staircase dominated the hall like the spine of some ancient beast, twisted like a ribbon through 3 floors in a style that must have been modern 2 centuries past. Its treads were shallow, far shallower than modern safety would permit, and worn to a dark polish by countless footfalls. The newel post at its base was a massive turned pillar of extraordinary craftsmanship, perhaps 8 inches across, with intricate lattice work carved into its surface. When I rapped it experimentally with the ferrule of my stick, it produced a hollow, almost musical note that seemed to resonate through the entire stairwell. The house was cold. Not merely cool, but genuinely cold, as though warmth had been forbidden entry. Even the portraits that lined the upper walls seemed to press their lips together in grim disapproval of the living. The air held that peculiar staleness of houses where windows are seldom opened, mingled with beeswax, old wool, and something else, a faint mustiness that suggested damp in the walls. Holmes's attention, which had been scattered and general as we entered, now focused with the abruptness of a lens brought to bear. He moved to the staircase with the careful steps of a hunter approaching uncertain ground, and I saw his eyes travel over every inch of the structure. The treads, the risers, the handrail, the carved balusters, the great newel post with its hollow, resonant quality. He paused where the banister swelled slightly, perhaps 1/3 of the way up the first flight. His long fingers traced the wood with a delicacy that was almost reverent, and then his eyes narrowed. A young housemaid had appeared from the servants' quarters, a nervous girl of perhaps 20, with reddened knuckles and that perpetually startled expression common to those who serve in houses where silence is valued above all things. Holmes turned to her with that sudden intensity which could be quite alarming to those unused to his ways. "You dust daily?" he asked, his voice sharp. "Every morning, sir," said she, bobbing a curtsy that spoke of long training in deference. "Regular as clockwork, sir. Mrs. Talbot, that's our cook, sir. She's very particular about the dusting." "Yet here," said Holmes, and I heard the note of satisfaction in his voice that told me he had found something significant. "Here." His long finger touched a spot within the carved lattice of the newel post, deep in one of the decorative hollows where shadow made seeing difficult. "Here is dust arranged, not removed." He lifted his finger into the light, and I saw that what came away wasn't the grey, fluffy substance of ordinary household dust, but a dark, almost black powder that left a sooty mark upon his skin. "Lampblack," said Holmes quietly, examining his fingertip with interest. "Common lampblack of the sort used by theatrical scene painters, or by chemists, or indeed by anyone wishing to darken a surface that would otherwise be too bright." Lady Eugenia had drawn closer, her face pale in the dim light of the hall. "I don't understand, Mr. Holmes. What does it mean?" "It means, madam, that someone has been at pains to make certain portions of this staircase less visible than they would naturally be. Now, why should anyone wish to do such a thing?" He did not wait for an answer, but had already moved on, his hawk-like profile silhouetted against the dusty window as he bent to examine the treads themselves. We were presently introduced to the other principals of the household, and I took the opportunity to observe each carefully, knowing that Holmes would later quiz me upon my impressions. Lionel Wyndham was a handsome man who looked younger than his 35 years, the sort of youthful appearance that comes not from clean living, but from careful grooming and the studied cultivation of fashionable ease. His face was somewhat florid, with that particular high colour which suggests too much time in overheated clubs and too many late hours. His dress was immaculate, his manner easy. Yet I detected beneath his affability a certain watchfulness, as though he were an actor very conscious of playing to an audience. When Holmes addressed him, he responded with appropriate concern, but I noticed his eyes were restless, moving about the hall as though seeking escape routes. The steward, Palfrey, presented an entirely different figure. He was a man of perhaps 60, with a wooden face that seemed carved from the same oak as the staircase itself. His manner embodied that respectful obstinacy which characterizes servants who have grown into a house as ivy grows into stone. They become part of its fabric, and any attempt to dislodge them would bring down plaster. He spoke in monosyllables, standing with his hands clasped before him, and his eyes held that carefully cultivated blankness which is the servant's first defence against the intrusions of curiosity. Miss Alice Fairbrook proved to be a young woman of perhaps 23, pale yet composed, with dark hair and grey eyes that held intelligence and more than a little courage. She had been present, I learned, on both occasions when the whisper had manifested most clearly, and I could see that the experience had shaken her profoundly. Yet she spoke of it with admirable precision, meeting Holmes's eyes directly, and answering his questions without the hysteria one might have expected from a young woman of her class and upbringing. "It called my name," she said simply, when Holmes inquired about the first incident. "I heard it distinctly, Alice, as though someone stood at the foot of the stair and whispered up to me. But there was no one there, Mr. Holmes. I looked, and the hall was empty. And yet the voice came again, 'Come down,' and something in the tone of it filled me with such dread that my knees failed me. I remember falling, and then Lady Eugenia was beside me, and I was upon the landing with salts being waved beneath my nose." "And the second occasion," Holmes prompted. "I was not present." Lady Eugenia heard it alone. Holmes nodded, filing this information away with that meticulous mental cataloguing which characterized his method. The Reverend Mr. Morley arrived during our inspection, announced by a timid tap at the door. He proved to be a young man of perhaps 28, clean-shaven, with the stooped shoulders and uncertain manner of one who spends too much time with books and too little with people. He wore a shabby suit of clerical black, and his boots were wet. I could smell the damp wool of his trousers and the peculiar odour of wet tweed that clung to his coat. He carried a leather-bound volume under one arm, which he clutched with nervous intensity. Upon being introduced to Holmes, he blushed deeply, a tendency which seemed to afflict him whenever addressed directly, and stammered something about the moral effect of superstition upon gentle households. He declared himself deeply interested in such phenomena from a philosophical and theological standpoint, and begged leave to pray with the ladies in the afternoon, if such would not be considered presumptuous. Holmes regarded him with that penetrating stare which so many found unnerving. "You have published upon the subject, I believe," said he. Morley's blush deepened. "A small tract only, Mr. Holmes, hardly worthy of notice. It concerned the acoustic properties of cathedrals and their tendency to produce what the ignorant might mistake for supernatural manifestations. I argued that many supposed miracles were merely the result of architectural accident combined with human credulity." "A rational position," said Holmes dryly. "And yet you allow for the possibility of genuine spiritual communication." "I allow," said Morley carefully, "that there are more things in heaven and earth than are dreamt of in our philosophy, Mr. Holmes. St. Paul himself speaks of principalities and powers." "Indeed," said Holmes, and turned away as though the man had ceased to interest him. But I saw him make a small note in the pocket-book he always carried, and I knew that the Reverend Mr. Morley's theology, like Lionel Wyndham's florid complexion and Palfrey's wooden stolidity, had been added to that vast index which Holmes maintained in his remarkable brain. We spent the better part of an hour upon that staircase, and I confess that even in daylight, with the household moving about their business, there was something oppressive about the place. Holmes moved with the careful precision of a surgeon, examining each tread, each riser, each section of the handrail. He was particularly interested in the underside of the treads, and more than once he lay upon his back upon the steps themselves, ignoring the dust and the indignity, to peer upward into the shadowy recesses where wood joined wood. At length he knelt upon the 7th step from the bottom, I remember the number precisely, and smiled that thin, satisfied smile which told me he had found something of significance. "Watson," said he quietly, gesturing me closer. "Observe." I knelt beside him and looked where he pointed. A brass screw was missing from the underside of the tread, exactly where a foot would take its weight when descending. The hole where the screw should have been was clearly visible, a darker circle in the pale wood underneath. And nearby, another screw gleamed with that same suspicious brightness we had seen in the specimen Lady Eugenia had brought to Baker Street. "Recently replaced," Holmes murmured, running his finger around the head of the bright screw. "Its slot is unmarred by dirt or corrosion. And see here." He touched the wood around it. "Fresh tool marks. Someone has been working upon this staircase, Watson, and working recently." He rose to his feet and sniffed the handrail like a bloodhound upon a scent. "Peppermint," he said to me, too low for the others to hear, though I saw Miss Fairbrook watching us with wide eyes from the landing above. Distinct and recent. Someone has been standing here, Watson, holding this rail, and breathing upon it. On the second landing, where the staircase made its turn toward the upper floors, a faint rubber reek clung to the wainscot like a persistent ghost, that peculiar acrid smell of India rubber, which, once noticed, is unmistakable. Holmes touched the panelling, ran his fingers along the join where wood met plaster, and nodded to himself as though confirming some private theory. Lady Eugenia had suggested we might wish to wait until evening to hear the whisper for ourselves, and Holmes had agreed readily. A cold supper was laid for us in the dining room, cold meats, cheese, bread, and a decent claret, and we dined in that peculiar silence which falls over households where fear has taken up residence. Lionel Wyndham made some attempt at conversation, speaking of the weather and the state of the roads, but his joviality rang hollow, and it soon died away into an uncomfortable quiet, broken only by the clink of cutlery upon china. We waited until the hour of dusk, when the lamps had been lit throughout the house, and the city beyond the windows had resolved itself into a kingdom of shadows. The household gathered in the hall, all save the cook and the boy, who had been dismissed to the kitchen. Lady Eugenia, Miss Fairbrook, Lionel Wyndham, Palfrey, and the Reverend Mr. Morley stood together at a little distance from the staircase, while Holmes and I positioned ourselves upon the landing. The hush that fell over us was profound, the sort of silence that seems to have weight and presence. I could hear the ticking of a long case clock in some distant room, the hiss of the gas jets, the faint creak of the house settling upon its foundations. My own breathing seemed loud in my ears, and I became conscious of my heartbeat, steady and insistent. And then I heard it. It came as Holmes had described it, a long, sinuous sibilation that seemed to creep up from the first recess of the stair like something alive. It was not wind. No draught could produce such a sound. It was not the groan of timber or the whisper of escaping air from ill-fitted joinings. It was more cunning than wind, more deliberate than accident. The sound rose through the hollow newel post, I was certain of it, and spread along the handrail like a current through water. And twice, as I stood frozen upon that landing, with my hand gripping the balustrade, it formed a word that might have been down. The effect upon the household was immediate and profound. Miss Fairbrook's hand shot out and gripped the rail with such force that her knuckles went white. Lady Eugenia drew in a sharp breath. Palfrey, that wooden man who had shown no emotion thus far, crossed himself with the automatic gesture of childhood training reasserting itself in extremity. Even Lionel Wyndham had gone pale, and I saw him step backwards, away from the staircase, as though putting distance between himself and something contagious. Only Holmes remained unmoved. He stood perfectly still, his head cocked slightly to one side, his eyes half closed in concentration. I knew that expression, had seen it 100 times when he listened to the approach of footsteps in Baker Street, or tracked the distant whistle of a train. He was not merely hearing, he was analyzing, dissecting, understanding. When the sound ceased, and it ceased as abruptly as it had begun, the silence that followed seemed even more oppressive than what had preceded it. Holmes set his jaw in that decisive manner which indicated he had reached a conclusion. From his waistcoat pocket he produced a small paper packet, the sort pharmacists use for powders, and opened it with careful precision. White powder cascaded onto his palm, and I recognized it as bismuth subnitrate, a substance used in medicine, but also, I knew, in certain scientific demonstrations. "For the night," he announced, his voice cutting through the tense silence. With a surgeon's care, he dusted the edges of certain risers and the curve within the newel post, creating a fine white coating that would, I realized, reveal any disturbance by showing finger marks or other contact. "No one is to descend or ascend between midnight and 2 o'clock. If the whisper would speak, it must choose its hour without us." He made his bow to Lady Eugenia with a sudden gravity that transformed his usually austere features into something almost gentle. "I have learned what I came to learn," said he. "Tomorrow will bring resolution, one way or another. I bid you good night, madam, and I trust you will rest easier, knowing that mysteries, however persistent, invariably yield to patient examination." We returned to Baker Street through streets that had grown dark and treacherous with fog. The lamps made islands of uncertain light in an ocean of obscurity, and more than once our driver had to slow to a crawl to avoid collision with other vehicles that loomed suddenly out of the murk. I was grateful for the warmth of our sitting room when we finally reached it, and for the steadiness of Mrs. Hudson's lamp as she brought us brandy and biscuits before retiring. Holmes sank into his chair with an air of deep satisfaction. There followed that profound quiet which is the mark of a mind at work. A silence I had learned never to interrupt, for it signified that Holmes was arranging his thoughts, fitting pieces together in patterns that would have remained invisible to any other observer. There are rooms in London where more talk is made than in ours. There are none where more is thought. He smoked no more than 2 pipes before he took down his violin and drew from it a sustained, thin note which made the windows tremble in their frames. The sound hung in the air like a visible thing, wavering slightly, dying away into whispered echoes. He listened with his eyes closed, his head tilted, as though the violin were speaking to him in a language I could not comprehend. Then he set the instrument down with careful precision, and smiled in a manner which told me he had found a friend in the wood of Wyndham House, had heard in its hollow resonance some secret it had been keeping. "Watson," said he, breaking the long silence, "what do you make of our cast of characters?" I considered for a moment. "Lionel Wyndham strikes me as a man with expensive tastes and possibly limited means. The steward seems honest if uncommunicative. The girl is genuinely terrified, and Lady Eugenia likewise. As for the reverend gentleman, he seems earnest enough, though perhaps too fond of his own theories." "All true," said Holmes, "and all potentially significant. But you have omitted the most important character of all." "Which is?" "The house itself, or more particularly, its staircase. Tell me, Watson, what did you observe about the construction of that newel post?" I cast my mind back. It was hollow. I could tell by the sound when I struck it. "Precisely. And what does a hollow newel suggest to you?" "A cavity, a space within." "Excellent. And in such a space, what might resonate?" Understanding began to dawn. "Sound," said I. "A voice might be amplified." "Or transmitted," Holmes interrupted. "A whisper, carefully placed, might travel through such a channel and emerge elsewhere, seeming to emanate from the wood itself. It is an old trick, Watson, as old as confessional boxes and whispering galleries in cathedrals. Our Reverend Mr. Morley would know of it, surely, given his tract upon acoustic phenomena in ecclesiastical architecture." "You suspect him?" Holmes made a dismissive gesture. "I suspect everyone until proven innocent, and no one until proven guilty. But consider, we have lampblack deliberately applied to conceal something. We have screws removed and replaced, suggesting someone has been working upon the structure. We have the smell of peppermint, a singer's remedy, or a means of masking one's breath. We have India rubber, which has 1,000 uses, but is particularly valuable for conducting sound or air in a flexible tube. And we have, above all, a household with tensions beneath its surface, a young cousin who may or may not stand to inherit, a ward who has caught the eye of a religious enthusiast, a steward who has served too long to welcome change, and a lady who guards her position with the vigilance of one who knows how easily such things can be lost." He leaned back and steepled his fingers. "Tomorrow, Watson, we shall see what the powder reveals. If I am not mistaken, someone in that household has been conducting experiments in acoustics of a most malicious sort, and when we discover who, we shall know why. And knowing why, we shall prevent what I very much fear was intended to be a final fatal performance." So the stage was set. A whispering stair, a house of anxious hearts, and Holmes with his ear turned, as he liked to say, to the grain of the world. I slept but poorly that night, waking more than once from dreams in which staircases whispered my name and beckoned me down into darkness. When I finally rose, with the grey dawn breaking reluctantly over London's rooftops, I found Holmes already dressed and examining a street map of Bloomsbury with that intense focus which told me the game was well and truly afoot. Chapter 3. Suspicions Multiply. We were at Wyndham House early, before the household had properly stirred, arriving just as the milkman made his rounds and the crossing sweepers began their daily battle against the accumulated filth of London's streets. The fog of the previous days had lifted somewhat, replaced by a cold, clear morning that made every sound seem sharp and every shadow distinct. Our breath plumed white in the air as we mounted the steps, and I remember thinking how different the house seemed in daylight. Less oppressive, more ordinary, as though the night had taken its mysteries with it into whatever realm such things inhabit. Lady Eugenia admitted us herself, still in her morning dress, her hair not yet properly arranged. The informality spoke of her anxiety, for a lady of her station would normally never receive callers in such a state of dishevelment. "Mr. Holmes," said she, her voice tight with suppressed emotion, "you must see what has happened." Holmes's powder had indeed taken a print, several prints in fact. Upon the 7th tread, where he had liberally dusted the previous evening, there was the clear impression of fingers, 4 of them, pressed into the white powder with the distinctive spacing of a hand gripping the underside of the step. But most tellingly, beneath the rail where it curved around the newel post, the powder had captured the half-moon shape of a gloved thumb, pressed firmly against the wood. Holmes examined these marks with his magnifying lens, his sharp profile bent close to the surface, the morning light from the hall window illuminating his concentration. "Gloved," he murmured. "Kid leather, I should say, and of good quality. The print is too smooth for wool or cotton. Someone stood here in the night and gripped this rail. But it was within the lattice of the newel post itself that the most curious evidence lay. Holmes had dusted the carved recesses liberally, and here the powder showed a disturbance of the most peculiar sort, a crescent-shaped clearing in the white surface, as though something curved had pressed against the wood. The lamp-black beneath was visible where the bismuth had been displaced, and the pattern suggested, impossibly, yet unmistakably, the shape of lips pursed to whisper. "Someone with a cold," I suggested, remembering our earlier conversation. "Someone who needed to breathe upon the wood." "Or a throat to husband," Holmes returned, his eyes glinting with that light which indicated a theory confirming itself. "Peppermint is the singer's friend, as well as the whisperer's, Watson. It soothes the throat and sweetens the breath, both admirable qualities in one who wishes to remain undetected in close quarters." The smell was indeed stronger now, brought out by the morning sun that warmed the old oak. That distinctive, medicinal sweetness of peppermint hung in the air around the staircase, like an accusation. Holmes straightened and turned to me with decision. "Watson, I have a commission for you. I need you to visit the club in Pall Mall at which Lionel Wyndham holds membership. You will find it listed in Kelly's directory. The Marlborough, I believe, or possibly the Atherton. Observe him if he is there. Note his habits, his preferences, his associations." "What am I looking for?" Holmes's smile was thin. "Watch his vice," said he. "Not the one he shows the world, but the one he attempts to conceal. Every man has his weakness, Watson, and weaknesses leave traces as surely as footprints in snow. Go now, while the morning is still young and the clubs are serving breakfast. A man's behavior at breakfast often tells more than his conduct at dinner when he is guarded and performing." I departed on my errand with that mixture of excitement and trepidation which always accompanied Holmes's investigations. The morning air was sharp and clean, and I welcomed the walk through streets that were waking to their daily commerce. The vendors were crying their wares, the omnibuses rumbling past with their loads of clerks and shop-girls, and the whole great mechanism of London was grinding into motion for another day. The Marlborough Club, for it proved to be that establishment, was a monument to that peculiar masculine comfort which characterized such institutions. Dark wood panelling, leather chairs worn smooth by generations of members, the smell of cigar smoke and old port permeating every surface. I gave my card and claimed to be looking for a fellow member, a small falsehood which the porter accepted with professional disinterest. I found Lionel Wyndham in the breakfast room, and what I observed there confirmed Holmes's suspicions in a manner that was both subtle and damning. He sat alone at a small table near the window, and before him lay not the Times or the Morning Post, but a racing form marked heavily with pencil notations. His breakfast remained largely untouched, a sure sign of a mind preoccupied with matters more pressing than food. But it was his cigar that told the tale Holmes had anticipated. The ash lay in his tray, grey and distinctive, with that peculiar flaky quality which Holmes had taught me to recognize as characteristic of Trichinopoly tobacco, an expensive import from India, favored by those who wish to distinguish themselves from the common run of cigar smokers. More significantly, I watched him accept another from a steward, and I noted the casual ease with which this transaction occurred, the familiarity that spoke of regular patronage and, almost certainly, a running account. His hands, too, bore examination. They were gentlemen's hands, certainly, with that peculiar softness that comes from a life unacquainted with manual labour. But the thumbnail of his right hand showed a pale crescent mark, the sort left by a file when one has been working at something that required precision and left metallic residue upon the nail. I departed the club with this intelligence and made my way back to Bloomsbury with a quickening step. The morning had advanced toward noon, and the streets were now crowded with the midday traffic. I found Holmes where I had left him, but he was no longer examining the staircase. Instead, he was in deep conversation with Palfrey, the steward, in a small room off the hall that served as the latter's office. The interview concluded as I entered, and I saw Palfrey's wooden face had acquired a faint flush. Whether of anger or embarrassment I could not immediately determine. Holmes dismissed him with a curt nod and turned to me with raised eyebrows. "Well, Watson?" "What have you learned?" I related my observations, the racing form, the Trichinopoly cigars, the filed thumbnail, the general air of a man under financial pressure. Holmes listened with that complete attention which made one feel that every word carried weight and significance. "Excellent," said he, when I had finished. "The ash confirms what the club servant told me yesterday. I sent a boy round with inquiries. Mr. Lionel Wyndham has tastes that exceed his income, and debts that exceed his resources. Trichinopoly at 2 shillings per cigar, faro at stakes he cannot afford, and tailoring bills that would beggar a nabob. A dangerous combination, Watson, when joined with proximity to wealth and opportunity. And Palfrey? What did you learn from him?" Holmes's expression darkened. "Our steward is not quite the pillar of reliability Lady Eugenia believes. He spent last night," he asserted, "within the butler's pantry, a claim I took the liberty of investigating. The pantry window shows evidence of a recent disturbance. The sash has been moved at 2 different heights, leaving marks in the accumulated grime that no amount of protestation can explain away. Moreover, his boots, which I examined while he fetched certain household records I requested, bear a tar-like smear, such as one might acquire by passing through the narrow mews behind this house, where a cooper's yard stores pitch and timber." "You think he was abroad last night?" "I think," said Holmes carefully, "that Mr. Palfrey's story requires closer examination. But there is a third player in this drama who interests me even more." As if summoned by Holmes's words, there came a timid knock at the front door, and presently the Reverend Mr. Morley was shown into the hall by the housemaid. He carried his leather-bound volume as before, clutched to his chest like a shield, and his manner was even more diffident than it had been at our previous meeting. Holmes greeted him with studied courtesy and drew him into conversation with an ease that masked the sharpness of his observations. Within 10 minutes he had learned that Morley was indeed the author of that tract on cathedral acoustics, that he had studied the phenomenon of whispering galleries in St. Paul's and in various continental churches, that he possessed considerable knowledge of how sound could be conducted and amplified through architectural features, and that he held, beneath his conventional theology, what he called advanced notions about the reality of spiritual communications. "I do not discount," said Morley earnestly, his pale face flushing with enthusiasm, "that the departed may attempt to reach us through whatever medium presents itself. If a cathedral's stone can carry a whisper across its dome, might not a house's timber carry a voice from beyond?" Holmes listened with apparent sympathy, but I saw his eyes narrow fractionally. "You have published these views." "A small monograph only, on acoustic marvels and their spiritual significance. I sent a copy to Miss Fairbrook. She has quite a philosophical mind, you understand." and we have had several most stimulating discussions upon the subject." "I'm sure you have," said Holmes dryly. "When Morley had departed, called away, he said, to attend a sick parishioner." Holmes turned to me with an expression I could not quite read. "3 plausible villains, Watson," said he, as we convened in the dining-room, where Lady Eugenia had laid a modest luncheon for us. Cold chicken, bread, cheese, and a light wine stood upon the sideboard, and we helped ourselves while Holmes organized his thoughts. A cousin with expensive vices and empty pockets, a steward who moves abroad in the night and lies about his whereabouts, a clergyman with knowledge of acoustics and an unhealthy interest in a young woman under this roof. Each has means, each has opportunity, and each might have motive. "And yet," I prompted, for I could hear the reservation in his voice. "And yet I prefer a 4th, said Holmes, biting into an apple with an abstraction that told me his mind was far away. "4th? Architecture, Watson. There is no knave so subtle as a bad joiner." He tapped the table lightly with his knuckles, producing a hollow sound. "Listen. This house is filled with spaces that should not exist, gaps between timber, channels behind panelling, voids within newel posts. Listen again." He rapped the rail of a nearby chair, and the note that answered had that same hollow timbre we had heard from the staircase. The stairs of St. Paul's Cathedral are cousins to these. A whisper spoken at the base travels upward through the hollow core and emerges at the top, seeming to have no earthly source. It is architecture, not magic, geometry, not ghosts. "But someone must have known of this property and exploited it," I objected. "Precisely, Watson. Architecture requires a tutor, someone to teach it how to speak. And I believe I know who that tutor is, though proof remains elusive. We must wait for evening once more." The afternoon passed slowly. Holmes spent much of it examining the house's structure, tapping walls, examining joinery, tracing the path of what he called dead spaces through the building's framework. He was particularly interested in the cellar and obtained Lady Eugenia's permission to explore it thoroughly. I accompanied him down the narrow stairs into that cold, dark realm beneath the house, where generations of stored goods lay gathering dust, and the air held that peculiar mineral smell of earth in close proximity. Holmes moved through the cellar with his dark lantern, its narrow beam picking out details in the gloom. Wine racks stood against one wall, most of them empty. Crates and hampers occupied another area, their contents long forgotten. And in a corner, half hidden behind old furniture, Holmes's light found what he had been seeking, evidence of recent disturbance in the dust, a cleared space where something had rested and been moved. "Mark this place, Watson," said he quietly. "We shall return here tonight." At dusk, the whisper came again, and this time Holmes was positioned to trace its path with methodical precision. He placed himself at various points along the staircase, while I stood watch, and I saw him nodding to himself as though confirming calculations. The whisper was clearer now, more confident, or perhaps we had simply become more attuned to hearing it. "Down! Down!" it called, and then that curious phrase, which seemed to carry such weight of menace, "Blood remembers." Lady Eugenia, standing at the top of the landing with Miss Fairbrook beside her, drew her shawl closer about her shoulders and trembled visibly. The phrase seemed directed at her specifically, and I saw Miss Fairbrook reach out to steady her employer with a hand that was itself none too steady. At the same instant, As I descended the stairs in pursuit of Holmes, a tread 3 steps below me yielded under my weight with a shallow groan that made my heart leap into my throat. For a moment, a single, terrifying moment, I felt the wood give way beneath me, and I had a vision of falling, striking my head upon the newel post as Sir Peregrine had done, lying broken at the foot of the stairs, while that malevolent whisper laughed above me. But the tread recovered itself with a lurch that nearly threw me against the rail, and then lay as innocent and solid as before, as though nothing had occurred. Holmes was at my side in an instant, his hand gripping my arm. "You are unhurt." "Shaken only," I managed, though my pulse hammered in my ears. Holmes's nostrils dilated in that way which indicated extreme interest. "Which tread?" I showed him, and he knelt immediately, producing his penknife with a speed that spoke of urgency. The blade slipped beneath the edge of the tread, and with careful leverage he lifted it enough to see what lay beneath. I heard his sharp intake of breath, that sound which meant a theory had solidified into fact. "Look, Watson." But carefully. I bent close. Beneath the tread, set into a channel that had been cunningly cut along its length, lay a thin tube of India rubber, perhaps a 1/4 inch in diameter, darkened with soot to render it invisible against the aged wood. The channel itself had been cut with extraordinary precision, not with the rough tools of a carpenter, but with something finer. A gentleman's knife, perhaps, or a surgical instrument. The tube ran forward toward the front edge of the tread, then turned sharply downward, disappearing into the thickness of the stair itself through a hole bored with meticulous care. "Palfrey?" I whispered, remembering the steward's long tenure and his intimate knowledge of the house's structure. "Palfrey would cut with a carpenter's hand, not a gentleman's manicure," Holmes murmured, his fingers tracing the edge of the channel. The work was indeed too fine, too precise, to have been done with rough tools. Moreover, Palfrey would not season his devilry with peppermint. No, this is the work of someone with education, refinement, and access to proper tools, someone who could work at leisure without arousing suspicion. Someone, perhaps, who has been studying Lionel Wyndham's fingers rather carefully. He had been doing precisely that, I recalled, examining the young man's hands with that attention to detail which missed nothing. The pale crescent of a file upon a thumbnail, the slight discoloration that comes from handling brass screws, the faint tremor that speaks of nerves under strain, all these Holmes had noted and filed away in that remarkable memory. We said nothing to the household then, though I confess the effort of maintaining composure cost me considerably. The knowledge that someone in this house, someone we had spoken with, perhaps broken bread with, had deliberately loosened that tread with the intention of causing a fall, possibly a fatal one, filled me with a cold rage that I had difficulty concealing. As we walked back through the fog-curtained squares toward Baker Street, my imagination peopled every arch with listeners and made a conspirator of every draught under every door. The whisper had acquired a human quality, that most disquieting quality of all. It was no longer an abstract mystery to be solved, but a deliberate malevolence to be stopped. Holmes must have sensed my thoughts, for he laid a hand briefly on my shoulder as we walked. "Tomorrow," said he quietly. "Tomorrow we end this. But tonight, Watson, we must prepare. The trap is laid, but the hunter must be patient if he wishes to catch his quarry." The gas lamps bloomed like pale flowers in the gathering darkness, and somewhere in the distance a church bell tolled the hour. London, indifferent to our discoveries, continued its eternal business. But in one tall house in Bloomsbury, evil had taken root and was preparing for its final performance. We would be ready. Chapter 4. A Night of Watching. Holmes loves a disguise as a poet loves a metre, with an instinctive completeness that goes beyond mere imitation and approaches something like transfiguration. I have seen him become, in the space of 20 minutes, and with no more apparatus than a borrowed coat and a studded slouch, a dozen different men. The aging cleric, the drunken groom, the woman of dubious profession. Each transformation was absolute, not merely in costume, but in the very carriage of the body, the rhythm of breath, the quality of attention in the eyes. That night, as the lamps of Baker Street flickered against the encroaching November darkness, and a thin rain began to streak the windows with its melancholy fingers, he set about such a transformation with the focused pleasure of an artist approaching a familiar canvas. From the depths of his wardrobe, that chaotic repository of 100 identities, he produced a workman's coat of rough serge, stained at the elbows with what might have been coal dust or street grime, and a cap whose peak had been worried into submission by long use. A coil of wire appeared next, authentic in every detail, its copper gleaming dully in the gaslight. Finally, he lifted down a battered dark lantern of the sort carried by night workers of the Gas, Light and Coke Company, complete with the company's stamp, half worn away by time and handling. Within moments, the transformation was complete. The lean, aristocratic figure of Sherlock Holmes had vanished, replaced by a weary tradesman of middle years, his shoulders rounded by labour, his gait the plodding shuffle of a man who has walked too many miles through too many cold streets. He caught my gaze in the mirror and smiled. Not Holmes's smile, but something altogether more tired and resigned. "You, Watson," he said, resuming his own voice with a mischievous glint, "are condemned once more to your native face, which I have always declared trustworthy, but wholly devoid of romance. Still, there is something to be said for a countenance that inspires confidence. You shall be the respectable gentleman caller, should we require explanation. I shall be the fellow come to inspect a reported gas leak in the lower floors, a complaint I took the liberty of lodging with the company this afternoon under a borrowed name." I could not help but smile at his thoroughness. "And if there is no leak, then I shall have done the gas company a service by conducting a precautionary inspection," he replied, gathering the coil of wire over his shoulder with the practised ease of a man who had done so 1,000 times. "Though I suspect, my dear fellow, that we shall find something far more interesting than a faulty valve." The streets were slick with rain as we made our way back toward Bloomsbury. The fog, which had threatened all day, now rolled in from the river in great billowing masses, transforming the familiar squares and thoroughfares into something strange and dreamlike. Gas lamps floated in the murk like drowning moons. The rattle of a late hansom came disembodied from the mist, its horses' hooves a muffled percussion on the wet stones. I found myself grateful for the weight of my service revolver in my coat pocket, though I could not have said precisely what I feared. We approached Wyndham House from the mews behind, where the narrow passage ran between high brick walls, slick with damp. The scent of horse and hay mingled with the acrid tang of pitch from the cooper's yard that Holmes had mentioned. That same yard whose black residue we had found upon Palfrey's boots. A cat yowled somewhere in the darkness, then fell silent, as if it, too, sensed the tension of our mission. Holmes produced a key. How he had obtained it I didn't ask, for he had his methods with landlords and housekeepers, and we let ourselves in through the scullery door. The house was dark, save for a single lamp left burning in the upper hall, its light a faint amber glow that barely reached the stairs. The kitchen was cold, the range banked for the night, and our footsteps on the flagstones seemed unnaturally loud, despite our caution. "The cellar," Holmes whispered, his voice barely more than a breath against my ear. "The tube we traced must, if it is to serve its purpose, breathe into some lower hollow. There must be a mechanism, a source, and it will be below, where sound can be channeled upward through the hollow stair." We descended a narrow flight of stone steps, each tread worn smooth by generations of servants' feet. The air grew colder, damper, carrying with it the familiar smell of old houses, mildew and coal dust, damp stone and ancient timber, and beneath it all something else, something faintly chemical that I could not quite place. Holmes's lantern threw wild shadows as we moved, making the cellar seem vaster than it was, transforming stacked hampers and forgotten furniture into looming, animate shapes, and then, half hidden behind a collection of wicker hampers and bundled linens that had clearly stood undisturbed for months, we found it. It was a small wooden chest, perhaps 2 feet square and 18 inches deep, constructed of plain deal, but with a craftsmanship that spoke of careful planning. The lid was hinged, and when Holmes lifted it with his long, sensitive fingers, I saw within a mechanism that was at once simple and diabolically clever. A bellows lay at the bottom, not unlike those used by organ tuners or by photographers to blow dust from their plates, fashioned from leather and wood, with joints that moved smoothly and silently when Holmes tested them with a gentle pressure. But it was the device fixed within the lid that commanded our attention. There, cunningly mounted with small brass screws, lay a reed and diaphragm assembly, such as might be found in a harmonica or reed organ. The reed was of thin brass, carefully filed and shaped, and beside it a small resonating chamber had been fashioned from what appeared to be a portion of a speaking trumpet, cut down and modified. When Holmes blew gently across the reed, it produced a soft, sibilant tone that made the hair rise upon the back of my neck, for it was precisely the quality of the whisper we had heard upon the stair. "Extraordinary," I breathed, leaning closer to examine the mechanism. "But how does it shape words?" "Observe," Holmes murmured, his voice tight with the excitement of discovery. He pointed to a length of india-rubber tubing that emerged from the side of the chest, the same tubing we had found beneath the tread upstairs. At its lower end, where it connected to the chest, a mouthpiece had been fitted, formed from a brass cone that would focus and direct the voice. A man places his mouth here, speaks in the merest whisper, and the sound travels up through the tube. The reed amplifies and distorts it, giving it that hollow, spectral quality. The oak of the stair itself becomes a sounding board, channeling and magnifying the whisper so that it seems to emanate from the wood itself, from nowhere and everywhere at once. I felt a cold admiration for the ingenuity of it, even as I was repelled by its purpose. It is a kind of speaking tube, then, but inverted, designed not to transmit conversation clearly, but to create the illusion of something supernatural. precisely, Watson. It is an Aeolian sermon given a satanic pulpit." He carefully lowered the lid and ran his fingers along the tube, where it disappeared upward through a hole bored in the ceiling beam. The hole had been carefully concealed with a wooden plug that could be removed when needed, and the beam itself showed signs of recent work. Fresh sawdust in the cracks, the bright mark of a bit upon the ancient timber. "Someone has planned this with considerable care," I observed, keeping my voice low. "The mechanism is too elaborate, too carefully constructed, to be the work of an impulse or sudden desperation." Indeed. This represents weeks of preparation, perhaps months. The tube had to be measured precisely, the channel beneath the tread cut and concealed, the reed tuned to the correct pitch. Our culprit is patient, methodical, and possessed of at least some mechanical skill, or access to someone with such skill. Holmes glanced at his watch in the dim lantern light. "It is now 12:30. If our whisper is to perform tonight, he must come soon. The household retires early, and he will want the maximum interval of safety." We extinguished the lantern and settled ourselves to wait, concealing our position behind the hampers, where we had a clear view of both the cellar stairs and the mechanism. The darkness was absolute, a living presence that pressed against the eyes and seemed to muffle even the sound of our breathing. I could hear my own heartbeat, unusually loud in my ears, and the faint creak of the house settling above us. Somewhere a pipe knocked gently against its housing. The rain had intensified, and I could hear its soft percussion on the pavement above, filtered down through stone and earth. Minutes stretched into what felt like hours. My legs cramped. I shifted as silently as possible, feeling Holmes's hand touch my arm in warning, urging stillness. The cold of the stone floor seeped through my coat and into my bones. I found my mind wandering, as it will during such vigils, to other nights of waiting. Ambushes in Afghanistan, lying in the dark with my rifle, while shadows moved in the moonlight. Late watches in Baker Street, while Holmes paced and theorized. Vigils at sickbeds during my medical training, waiting for crisis or recovery. And then, so faint I almost missed it. A sound. A door opening, far above. The whisper of cloth against wood. Footsteps, careful, measured, testing each tread before trusting it with full weight. Someone was descending the main stairs with the practiced caution of one who knows which steps creak and which do not. Holmes's fingers closed on my wrist, a pressure of warning and readiness. I felt him tense beside me, every sense focused on the approaching presence. The footsteps reached the ground floor, paused. I could imagine the listener standing in the darkness, head cocked, ensuring the house slept. Then came toward the kitchen, toward the cellar stairs. A faint glow appeared above, the dim illumination of a candle carefully shielded. The footsteps descended into the cellar, and in the wavering light I saw a figure in stockinged feet, moving with the careful silence of one who has made this journey before and knows every obstacle, every loose stone. At 1 o'clock precisely, I heard the distant chime of a church bell marking the hour. The figure reached the bottom of the stairs and moved directly toward the mechanism. There was no hesitation, no searching. He knew exactly where it was, exactly what he sought. The candle was set upon a shelf, and in its light I saw the clean-shaven jaw and the somewhat florid cheek of Lionel Wyndham. His face bore an expression I had not seen in our earlier meetings, a kind of focused intensity, almost exaltation, as if he were about to perform some sacred rite. He wore a dressing gown of dark silk over his nightshirt, and his feet in their wool stockings made no sound on the stone floor. He knelt before the chest with the ease of long practice, lifted the lid, and checked the mechanism with quick, efficient movements. His hands adjusted the bellows, tested the tension of the springs, ran along the rubber tubing to ensure no kinks or blockages. Then he lifted the mouthpiece to his lips, worked the bellows with one hand, and spoke softly, carefully, shaping each word with theatrical precision. The whisper that resulted made my flesh crawl, even though I knew its source. It seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere, a voice that bypassed the ear and spoke directly to some primitive part of the brain where fear lives. "Down, Eugenia," it said, each word a serpentine hiss. "Blood remembers." The phrase hung in the air like smoke. Lionel released the bellows, waited a moment, then repeated the performance, adding a variation. "Come down to me, Eugenia." Blood always remembers. It was the repetition that broke the spell of horror and replaced it with cold anger. This was not supernatural dread, but calculated cruelty, the deliberate torture of a woman who had shown Lionel nothing but kindness. I felt Holmes's muscles coil beside me, and I knew he was preparing to move. Holmes moved like a cat, or rather, like some larger feline, a panther perhaps, all-controlled power and absolute silence. In a moment, his long arm had locked around Lionel's elbows from behind, pinning them to his sides with an efficiency that spoke of his boxing prowess and his knowledge of leverage points. I sprang forward with the lantern, unshuttering it so that its full glare fell upon both their faces. Lionel Wyndham stared at us, his eyes wide with shock, his mouth falling open in a soundless gasp of dismay. For a heartbeat he attempted to struggle, but Holmes's grip was absolute. Then something in him collapsed. I saw it happen as clearly as if a string had been cut, and he sagged in Holmes's grasp like a puppet whose master had abandoned it. "You would have had her fall," Holmes said quietly, his voice carrying none of the triumph one might expect, but only a kind of cold statement of fact, as if he were reciting evidence in a courtroom. He nodded toward the mechanism, then to a small bundle I had not noticed before, lying upon the shelf beside where the candle guttered. "Watson, if you would be so kind." I lifted the bundle and untied the club twine that bound it. Within were a dozen brass screws of varying lengths, a bradawl with its point still bright and sharp, a small file, and, damning detail, a pot of lampblack with a brush laid across its rim. The twine itself bore the distinctive red thread that marked it as coming from one of the gentlemen's clubs in Pall Mall. "You would loosen and retighten the screws," Holmes continued in that same measured tone, "until the night made your work believable. You would call your aunt to descend in darkness, her nerves already shattered by weeks of supernatural terrorization. The tread would give way, not completely, not so suddenly as to be obviously mechanical, but enough. A fall, a cry, the household roused to find Lady Eugenia lying upon the lower landing with a broken neck or a fractured skull. An accident, they would say. The same accident that claimed Sir Peregrine. The stair was always dangerous. She was nervous, frightened by the whispers. She missed her step in the dark. Who could say otherwise? "No," Lionel whispered. But there was no conviction in the denial. His face had gone grey in the lamplight, the florid handsomeness collapsing into something weak and haggard. "No, I never meant. It was only to frighten. Only to drive her from the house, perhaps." Holmes's eyebrow rose. "Or only to secure certain valuables while the household was in disarray. Or perhaps, in the end, only to inherit what you could not win by fortune or earn by labor." He released Lionel, who slumped onto the shelf beside his mechanism, his head falling into his hands. Holmes began methodically searching him, and the inventory was damning. From the inside pocket of the dressing gown came a leather wallet containing 3 pawn tickets, each describing items of jewelry. I read them over Holmes's shoulder. A necklace of old paste, 3 small garnets. But Holmes's brow rose at that description, and I knew he read something different in those words than what the pawnbroker had been told. From the outer pocket came a card case, and folded small within it, creased and recreased, as if it had been taken out and studied many times, was a bookmaker's demand for payment. The sum was staggering, nearly £800, due within the fortnight. The bookmaker's name was one I recognized, a hard man who operated from rooms near Covent Garden, and whose methods of collection were rumoured to be both inventive and painful. And finally, on a lower shelf, standing beside a stack of old newspapers and illuminated now by my lantern's light, a small glass bottle half full of white lozenges. I lifted it and read the label. "Peppermint lozenges for the relief of sore throat and cough." The edges of several lozenges visible through the glass were worn and sucked thin. "For your whisper," Holmes said softly. "Peppermint coats the throat, prevents irritation, allows one to maintain that sibilant quality for longer periods. Singers use it, actors use it. Apparently, so do those who would personate ghosts in the service of murder." Lionel made a broken sound, something between a laugh and a sob. "The necklace was paste," he said wildly, his voice cracking with desperation, or perhaps merely with the final collapse of his pretensions. "I took it to pawn. It was only paste. Eugenia said so herself, said it was a replica she had made when the original was sold years ago. I only thought. You thought to sell it twice," Holmes interrupted, his voice gaining an edge now. "Once to the pawnbroker, who would indeed assess it as paste and give you perhaps £1 or 2 based on the setting. And then, with the ticket in hand, you would approach a certain collector in Holborn, a man whose name I shall not speak, but whose taste for antique settings is well known to those who deal in such things. He would not care whether the stones were paste or genuine. The metalwork alone, if it is the piece I believe it to be, would be worth £100 or more to the right buyer. You had already arranged the sale, had you not? The pawn ticket was merely insurance, a way to appear innocent should questions be asked." There was silence then, broken only by the sound of Lionel's breathing, harsh, ragged, the breathing of a man whose world has ended. I found myself, against my better judgment, feeling a flicker of pity for him. He was weak rather than wicked, desperate rather than evil, caught in the grip of debts he could not pay, and habits he could not break. But then I thought of Lady Eugenia's face, the genuine terror in her eyes, the trembling of Miss Fairbrook's hands as she recounted the whisper calling her name, and my pity hardened into something colder. "What shall we do with him?" I asked, though I knew the answer. There was only one thing to be done. Holmes glanced at his watch. "It is nearly 2 o'clock. We shall secure the evidence, the chest, the tube, the the tools, and our prisoner. But I think we shall not rouse the household until morning." His voice softened slightly, and I saw in his face something of that merciful quality that existed alongside his implacable logic. The night has whispered enough. Let it keep one secret until dawn. Lady Eugenia deserves a few hours of untroubled sleep before she must face this betrayal. We bound Lionel's wrists, not roughly, but firmly, with his own belt, and I kept watch over him, while Holmes carefully dismantled the mechanism, making notes in his pocketbook about its construction. He photographed the scene with the small camera he had taken to carrying, its flash powder briefly illuminating the cellar in harsh white light that left floating ghosts across my vision. Every detail was recorded, every piece of evidence secured. As we worked, Lionel sat slumped against the wall, saying nothing. Once he looked up at me, and I saw in his eyes something I had seen before in other men. That peculiar emptiness that comes when hope dies, and one realizes that the future has narrowed to a single, dark channel from which there is no escape. I looked away, uncomfortable with such naked despair. When we emerged at last from the cellar, leaving Lionel in the temporary custody of a constable whom Holmes had stationed in the scullery, the air above Bedford Square had that pale translucence which belongs only to the hour when London decides whether to be night or day. The rain had stopped, and the fog was lifting in patches, revealing stars between the rolling clouds. The eastern sky was beginning to show the faintest suggestion of light, that deep blue that precedes the dawn. Holmes paused on the steps, looking up at that transforming sky with an expression I had learned to recognize, the look of a man stepping back from intense concentration, allowing his mind to relax and range freely. He drew a long breath of the cold air, and I saw some of the tension leave his shoulders. "Architecture, Watson," he observed, his voice meditative now, the crisp edge of the investigation giving way to that philosophical mood that sometimes took him in the quiet hours. "Architecture becomes accomplice when vanity hires it and poverty instructs it. This house, with its twisted stair and hollow newels, was built 200 years ago by a man who loved clever carpentry more than he loved honesty of construction. He made channels where there should have been solid wood, left spaces where there should have been none, all for the sake of an elegant line and a lighter tread. His vanity created the possibility. Lionel's poverty exploited it. And yet," he paused, running his hand along the iron railing that guarded the steps, his fingers tracing the cold metal as if reading some message in its curves. "And yet," he continued, "it sings sweetly when taught by the right hand. That same hollow stair could have been used for beauty rather than terror, could have been made to carry music instead of whispers, could have amplified a song instead of a threat. The instrument is neutral. It is the musician who makes it divine or damnable." I thought about this as we walked slowly back toward Baker Street, our footsteps echoing on the empty pavements, the city beginning to stir around us as the first market carts rumbled past and the first servants emerged to scrub steps and beat rugs. It was a truth I had encountered before in my friendship with Holmes, that the difference between virtue and villainy was often merely a matter of application, that the same skills that made a great detective could, in different hands or with different intentions, make an equally great criminal. By the time we reached our rooms, the sun was rising over the rooftops, turning the chimney pots to gold and the wet streets to ribbons of light. Mrs. Hudson, bless her, was already up and had coffee waiting, its aroma filling the sitting room with blessed warmth and normalcy. Holmes poured for both of us, his movements precise and careful. The movements of a man who has finished a difficult task and is now allowing himself to return to the rhythms of ordinary life. He settled into his chair with a sigh of satisfaction and regarded the tiny eddies upon the coffee's surface as if they held some secret wisdom. Thus, the last link was forged, he said quietly, more to himself than to me. The whisper had acquired its tongue, and the stare its intended victim. Now, both shall be silent, and perhaps that is for the best. I nodded, too tired for words, and together we sat in comfortable silence as the morning came fully alive outside our windows, and London, that great beast of a city, stretched and yawned and began another day. Chapter 5. Blood remembers. By 9 o'clock, the household of Wyndham House were gathered in the drawing-room, assembled at Holmes's request, delivered by a note that had arrived with the morning post. I had returned to Baker Street only long enough to wash and change my linen before accompanying Holmes back to Bedford Square, and I confess that fatigue sat heavily upon me. Yet Holmes seemed as fresh as if he had slept a full night in his own bed, his eyes bright with that peculiar energy that animated him when a case approached its resolution. The drawing-room was a long chamber on the first floor, overlooking the square through windows that let in the pale morning light. It had been furnished in the manner of 40 years previous, heavy mahogany pieces upholstered in dark green brocade that had faded at the arms and back, portraits in gilded frames upon walls papered in a pattern of autumn leaves, a carpet whose once vivid colours had mellowed to soft, dusty tones. A fire had been lit in the grate, but it did little to warm the room, which retained that chill common to houses where unhappiness has taken root. Lady Eugenia sat nearest the fire, her posture erect despite the evident cost to her composure. She was dressed in a morning gown of grey silk, severe and proper, and her hands rested in her lap with that forced stillness that speaks of iron self-control. Her face was tight-lipped, pale beneath the powder, but her eyes were clear and steady as they met Holmes's. Whatever terrors had haunted her sleep, she had set them aside now, facing this morning with the courage of her class and character. Miss Alice Fairbrook occupied a chair beside her guardian, and the change in her was striking. The fearful, trembling girl who had fainted on the landing had been replaced by someone altogether more formidable. Her jaw was set, her colour high, and her eyes flashed with what I recognized as righteous indignation, that particularly fierce anger that arises when one discovers that fear has been manufactured rather than earned, that the supernatural terror that shook one's faith in the world's order was merely human malice wearing a ghostly mask. She had courage born of fury, and I found myself admiring her for it. Palfrey stood by the window, his hands clasped behind his back in an attitude that might have been military were it not for the slight stoop of his shoulders. His wooden face betrayed nothing, but I saw his eyes move constantly, taking in each detail of the scene, and I wondered what passed behind that impassive exterior. Loyalty to the house, certainly, but loyalty to which member of it? His stillness had the quality of ancient oak, patient and enduring. The Reverend Mr. Morley clutched his hat as if it were the last good thing that would stay with him, turning it round and round in his hands in a gesture that spoke of acute discomfort. He had positioned himself near the door, as if contemplating flight, and his gentle, scholarly face wore an expression of bewilderment and distress. I recalled Holmes's suspicion that he might have played some role in the deception, but looking at him now, I doubted it. He had not the constitution for conspiracy. His was the temperament that earnestly believed in acoustic marvels and sought always to find some rational, yet still wondrous, explanation for the world's mysteries. And Lionel Wyndham, between two constables whom Holmes had quietly summoned at daybreak, had put his head upon his breast and would not look at anyone. He had been allowed to dress, and he wore a suit of good cloth, gone slightly shabby at the cuffs, his collar wilted, his necktie askew. In the morning light he looked older than his 35 years. The dissipation that club life had written upon his features now plain to read. The florid handsomeness had collapsed into something weak and wasted, and I found myself thinking of medieval morality plays, where vice appears first as a seducer and ends as a skeleton. Holmes stood before the fireplace, and I took my positions beside him, feeling once again that curious doubling of purpose that attended our partnership. I was witness and chronicler, yes, but also moral support and occasionally restraint, the anchor that kept Holmes's flights of pure logic tethered to human concerns. He glanced at me once, briefly, and I saw in his eyes a flicker of something that might have been gratitude or simply acknowledgement of my presence. He addressed them without flourish, without theatrical preamble, his voice level and clear. This was Holmes the scientist, the expositor of fact, stripping away mystery to reveal mechanism. Yet there was, beneath the clinical precision, a thread of genuine feeling, anger at the cruelty perpetrated, sympathy for its victims, and perhaps a touch of that austere moral indignation that he rarely showed, but deeply felt. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, "you have been subjected these past weeks to a campaign of terror calculated to undermine your peace, your security, and perhaps your very sanity. You have been told that your house whispers, that it remembers blood, that supernatural forces walk your stairs. I am here to tell you that what you heard was precisely that, a whisper, but one that originated in human lungs and emerged from human malice, not from any spectral agency." He showed them first the wooden chest which the constables had carried up from the cellar at his instruction. It sat now upon the drawing-room table like an accusation, its plain deal construction somehow more sinister in the morning light than it had been in the cellar's darkness. Holmes lifted the lid, revealing the bellows and the reed mechanism, and explained its function in terms that even the least mechanically minded could grasp. "A bellows such as this," he said, working it gently so they could see its construction, "provides the breath. The reed provides the tone. And this," he indicated the india-rubber tube, which lay coiled beside the chest like a serpent, "provides the channel. The whisper is spoken into the mouthpiece here, travels up through the tube, and emerges through the reed, amplified and distorted. The oak of the staircase itself, being largely hollow in its construction due to the architectural choices made when this house was built, acts as a resonating chamber, carrying the sound along its length and making it seem to come from the wood itself." He placed the reed mechanism to his own lips, and I saw several of those present flinch in anticipation. Holmes spoke softly, almost conversationally. "Down, Eugenia." But the whisper that emerged from the mechanism was anything but conversational. It was that same sinuous, inhuman sibilance we had heard 2 nights before, seeming to come from nowhere and everywhere, bypassing reason and speaking directly to primal fear. Miss Fairbrook gasped. Lady Eugenia closed her eyes briefly, and when she opened them again, they were bright with unshed tears. Not of fear now, but of rage at having been so manipulated. "You see," Holmes said, setting down the mechanism with a gentleness that contrasted with the violence of emotion it had provoked. "There is nothing supernatural here. Only craft, admittedly clever craft, but craft nonetheless. The whisper is as human as the hand that built this device." He replaced the tread next, carrying it to the table with care and setting it down so that its underside was visible. The channel cut beneath it was evident now in the morning light, a groove perhaps an inch wide and a 1/4 inch deep, running the length of the tread and ending in a hole drilled up through the oak. The tube had been laid in this channel, concealed from above by the tread itself, and hidden from below by the riser. "Observe here," Holmes continued, pointing to several of the screw holes, where screws have been removed and replaced repeatedly. "The wood around the holes is compressed, worn by the repeated insertion and removal of the screws. Some of these screws," he indicated 3 in particular, "were found to be loose when Dr. Watson and I first examined the stair. One was missing entirely." He laid upon the table the collection of screws we had found in the cellar, and beside them the bradawl with its bright, sharp point. "With these tools, one could loosen the screws securing a tread, making it unstable. A person stepping upon that tread in darkness, already frightened by the whispers they had heard, already convinced that supernatural forces were at work, such a person might well miss their footing. They might fall, striking their head upon the newel or the lower landing. An accident, it would seem. The same sort of accident that claimed Sir Peregrine Wyndham last year, though in that case the loosened tread was the result of a poor maintenance rather than malicious design." Palfrey made a sound, perhaps of protest, or perhaps merely of recognition. Holmes glanced at him. "You did your best, Mr. Palfrey, to maintain this house properly. But you are one man, and this is an old house with old problems. The fault wasn't yours, though I suspect you have blamed yourself for Sir Peregrine's death. Rest assured, that was truly an accident. What has transpired since, however, was not." He laid upon the table, with the careful spacing of a man arranging evidence for a jury, the remaining items, the pawn tickets, creased and worn from repeated handling, the bookmaker's note with its brutal finality, a small handful of cigar ash preserved in a twist of paper, which he had collected from the cellar shelf, and finally the bottle of peppermint lozenges. "These items tell the story of motive and means," Holmes said. "The pawn tickets speak of financial desperation. Mr. Lionel Wyndham is, or was, a man of expensive habits and limited means. He gambled, and he lost. He borrowed, and he could not repay. The bookmaker's note you see here represents a debt of £800 due within days. Such a debt, left unpaid, would result in consequences far more immediate and painful than mere embarrassment." He picked up the twist of paper containing the ash, opened it carefully, and let a few grey fragments fall onto a white sheet he had placed on the table for the purpose. "Trichinopoly cigars," he observed. "A distinctive ash, grey, friable, holding its form. Mr. Wyndham smokes them habitually. I observed the ash in the cellar where he worked on his mechanism. Dr. Watson confirmed that he smokes them at his club as well. A small detail, perhaps, but one of many. Finally, he lifted the bottle of peppermint lozenges, holding it up, so the light passed through the glass and illuminated the worn edges of the sweets within. And this, the whisper's friend. Peppermint soothes the throat, prevents irritation, allows one to maintain the sibilant tones necessary for this particular deception. I observed it on Mr. Wyndham's breath during our first interview. I found traces of peppermint oil upon the mouthpiece of the whispering device. And here is the bottle itself, kept ready for use in the cellar where the mechanism was stored. He set down the bottle and turned to face Lionel directly. The young man, for he seemed young now, stripped of his pretensions and his schemes, raised his head slowly, reluctantly, like a prisoner ascending to the dock. "Men betray themselves by what they prefer," Holmes said, and though his voice was quiet, it carried a weight of judgment that made the words seem graven in stone. Mr. Wyndham's preference for trichinopoly betrayed his presence in the cellar. His debts betrayed his motive. The file marks upon his thumbnail. Here he gestured, and I saw that Lionel's hands, resting upon his knees, bore indeed those very marks, betrayed the fact that he, not a workman, had filed and fitted the screws, and the peppermint upon his breath betrayed the whisper as surely as if he had signed his name to it. Lady Eugenia spoke for the first time, her voice steady, despite the tremor I could see in her hands. "Purpose," she whispered, and the single word carried such a weight of betrayal that I found myself looking away from her face. "What was your purpose, Lionel?" Holmes answered for him, with a gentleness that surprised me, for he understood, as perhaps only he could, how difficult it was to hear treachery named aloud when it came from one's own blood. "To frighten you, Lady Eugenia, into descending the stairs when you were most susceptible. Late at night, your nerves already shattered by weeks of supernatural terrorization, and when the treads were most untrustworthy, loosened by his careful work. To create the conditions for what would appear to be a tragic accident, identical to the one that claimed Sir Peregrine. In the confusion that would follow such a fall, certain valuables might be secured and removed. Your ward, Miss Fairbrook, might be similarly frightened and perhaps similarly injured, and in the end, should all else fail, the inheritance that could not be won by merit or fortune might be secured by eliminating those who stood between Mr. Wyndham and the estate." He paused, and in that pause I heard the fire crackle, heard someone, Morley, I think, draw a sharp breath, heard the constable shift his weight with a creak of leather. "He chose his words with care," Holmes continued. "Blood remembers," a phrase calculated to quicken the imagination, which grief had already sensitized by Sir Peregrine's fall. It suggested family curse, ancient wrong, spectral vengeance, all the machinery of Gothic terror designed to convince you that the danger was supernatural and therefore inescapable. Better to flee the house entirely, he might have hoped, leaving it to his management and disposal. At this, Mr. Morley started forward, his scholarly face flushed with distress. "But Sir Peregrine," he stammered, "was that also? Did Lionel—" "An accident," Holmes replied, and his voice was firm, almost sharp, cutting through the speculation before it could take root. He turned to Palfrey. "I examined the stair most carefully, Mr. Palfrey. The screw that failed beneath Sir Peregrine's foot had been loose for months, perhaps years. The wood around it was weathered. the threads worn by time and the subtle working of the house's settling. There were marks of old clumsy maintenance under the fifth riser, repairs predating Mr. Lionel's invention by years. Sir Peregrine's death was truly accidental, the result of age and deferred maintenance, not malice. I saw relief flood Palfrey's face, saw his shoulders straighten as if a weight had been lifted from them. He had blamed himself, I realized, had spent a year believing that his failure to maintain the house properly had killed his master. Holmes, with typical consideration, had chosen to address this guilt publicly, absolving the steward before the entire household. Mr. Wyndham only borrowed the tragedy, Holmes continued. A bad joiner gave him his plot, debt gave him his motive, and the workman's file upon his thumbnail and the peppermint upon his breath gave him to me. Lionel made a broken sound, something between a laugh and a sob, a sound I had heard before from men at the breaking point. He looked up, his face twisted with an emotion I could not quite name. Shame, certainly, but also a kind of desperate defiance, the last protest of a man who has nothing left to lose. "The necklace was paste," he said wildly, his voice cracking with strain. "I took it to pawn. It was only paste. Eugenia said so herself, years ago, when Uncle Peregrine lost the estate to those damned investments. She said the real one had been sold, that she'd had a copy made in paste and garnets. I thought—" He broke off, swallowing hard. "I only thought I might get a few pounds for the setting. I never meant. It was just to buy time, to hold off the creditors until you could arrange a private sale." Holmes interrupted, and his voice had lost its gentleness now, taking on an edge like steel beneath silk. His lip twitched with something that might have been contempt or might have been simple weariness at human foolishness. Paste to the pawnbroker, certainly, who would assess it at face value and advance you perhaps 30 shillings on the strength of the metalwork. But you had already been in contact with a certain collector in Holborn, a man whose name I shall not speak in present company, but whose taste for antique settings is well known among those who deal in such things. He drew from his pocket a folded paper, which he opened with care. It was a letter, I saw, written in an educated hand on expensive stationery. Holmes did not read it aloud, but he summarized its contents with the precision of a lawyer presenting evidence. "This gentleman wrote to you 3 weeks ago, confirming his interest in the Wyndham piece and offering a sum of £120 for the setting alone, regardless of the authenticity of the stones. The workmanship, he noted, was of the late 17th century and bore the mark of a known craftsman. Such pieces are rare, Mr. Wyndham. Your aunt's necklace, paste or no, was worth far more than she believed, and far more than you deserved." Lady Eugenia's hand went to her throat, an instinctive gesture, and I saw understanding dawn in her eyes. "The old necklace," she breathed, "the one that was my grandmother's. I thought I was told." "You were told the stones were paste, and likely they are," Holmes said, more gently now. "The original gems were probably sold decades ago and replaced with glass, a common enough practice among families in financial difficulty. But the setting itself, the gold filigree and the craftsmanship retained substantial value, value that Mr. Wyndham recognized and sought to exploit. With the pawn ticket in hand, he could claim the piece had been stolen, collect what insurance there might be, sell the necklace privately, and use your death or flight to cover the theft. 3 profits from 1 crime. Quite economical in its way." There was a long silence then, broken only by the hiss and pop of the fire. I looked at Lionel and saw that he had shrunk into himself, his head once more upon his breast, all fight gone out of him. He was weeping, I realized, not the dramatic tears of remorse, but the helpless, exhausted weeping of complete defeat. I found I could spare no pity for him now. Whatever desperation had driven him, he had chosen his path, had constructed his machine of terror with patience and care, had been prepared to watch his own aunt fell to her death rather than face the consequences of his own weakness. Lady Eugenia stood, and every eye in the room turned to her. She walked slowly to where Lionel sat between his guards, and for a moment I thought she might strike him, might give physical expression to the betrayal that must have been churning in her heart. But she did not. She stood looking down at him with an expression of such profound sadness that it was more damning than any anger could have been. "You were always welcome here," she said quietly. "After your father died, after you lost your own inheritance to drink and gambling, I took you in. I asked nothing of you but honesty and decent behavior. If you had needed money, if you had come to me openly, we might have found a way. But you chose this. You chose to make me afraid in my own home. You chose to threaten Alice, who has never done you anything but kindness. For that, Lionel, I cannot forgive you. Not yet. Perhaps not ever." She turned away from him then, returning to her seat with the same upright dignity she had maintained throughout. Lionel made no response, gave no defence. What defence could there be? Holmes gave a small signal, and the constables lifted Lionel to his feet. He went with them docilely, without resistance, and I watched him pass through the drawing-room door and out of the life of Wyndham House forever. The law would take him now. Trial, certainly. Prison, almost certainly. Transportation, perhaps. His life, such as it had been, was over, and in its place would be only the grey years of punishment and regret. When he was gone, Holmes turned back to those who remained. His expression had softened, and I saw in his face that quality of compassion that he usually kept carefully hidden, believing, wrongly in my opinion, that sentiment weakened the exercise of pure reason. "I know this has been a distressing revelation," he said, "to discover that one's fears were not groundless, but were deliberately manufactured by someone you trusted. That is a particular kind of violation. But I hope you can take some comfort in knowing that there was never anything supernatural in your house. No ghosts walked your stairs. No ancient curse hung over your family. There was only a man and a machine and the exploitation of natural acoustic properties. The whispers are silenced now. The mechanism will be destroyed, and the stairs, once the channels are sealed and the treads properly secured, will be nothing more than stairs." Miss Fairbrook spoke then, her voice stronger than I had yet heard it. "But the house knew," she said, with the air of one working through a difficult problem. "In a way, it did know. The hollow stair, the channels in the wood. Those weren't Mr. Wyndham's creation. They were already there, waiting. He simply found them and used them." "Exactly so, Miss Fairbrook," Holmes replied, and I saw approval in his eyes. "The house was built with these characteristics 2 centuries ago by architects and joiners who valued elegance over solidity. They created the possibility. Mr. Wyndham merely exploited it. In that sense, you might say that the house did whisper, but only because someone had learned to make it speak." Lady Eugenia stood again, and this time she approached Holmes directly. She took his hand, a gesture that clearly surprised him, for he was not a man comfortable with physical expressions of gratitude, and held it briefly between both of hers. "Mr. Holmes," she said, and her voice was steady now, cleared of fear and strengthened by relief. "You have given me back my home. You have given me back my peace of mind. You have shown me that the evil I faced was not eternal or supernatural, but merely human, and therefore conquerable. I cannot adequately express what that means to me. If there is ever anything I can do to repay you—" "There is no debt, Lady Eugenia," Holmes said, gently extracting his hand with that awkwardness he always displayed when confronted with deep emotion. "I have done only what any reasoning man might do, given the evidence. The credit, if any is due, belongs as much to Dr. Watson, whose steady support and practical wisdom provided the foundation for my deductions." I felt my face warm at the unexpected praise, but said nothing. It was Holmes's way to deflect attention from himself at the moment of triumph, to spread credit among others, even when the brilliant insight had been entirely his own. The household began to disperse then, each person carrying away their own thoughts and feelings about what had been revealed. Palfrey, I noticed, paused to examine the mechanism on the table with a kind of professional interest, the builder's curiosity about construction overcoming the horror of its purpose. Morley approached Holmes with questions about the acoustic properties of hollow wood, his scholarly nature already beginning to analyze and categorize what he had witnessed. Miss Fairbrook stood at the window, looking out at Bedford Square, with an expression of someone seeing familiar things made new. Holmes and I took our leave, carrying with us the mechanism and the other evidence which would be needed for the trial. As we descended the front steps, those same steps we had climbed so many times in the past weeks, I felt the house settling back into silence behind us, a good silence now, the silence of peace rather than the silence of dread. The workmen would come later, Holmes assured me. The channels would be filled, the hollow spaces packed with solid wood, the treads secured with screws that would not be loosened by design or neglect. The Whispering Stair would become simply a staircase, its brief career as an instrument of terror ended forever. We walked back through the streets of Bloomsbury in the full light of morning, the city alive and bustling around us. The fog had burned away entirely, leaving a sky of pale, washed blue. Carts rumbled past, shop doors opened, an organ grinder cranked out a cheerful tune while his monkey performed for pennies. The ordinary life of London, that great heartbeat of commerce and conversation, went on unchanged by the small drama that had played out in Wyndham House. And yet, I thought, for those who had lived through it, everything had changed. Lady Eugenia would sleep peacefully now. Miss Fairbrook would walk her stairs without fear. The house would be simply a house again, its architecture appreciated for beauty rather than dreaded for its acoustic properties. That was the gift Holmes gave to those he helped. Not merely the solution to a puzzle, but the restoration of ordinary life, the gift of being able to trust once more in the solid reality of the world. That evening found us back in our rooms in Baker Street, that familiar sanctuary where so many cases had been discussed, dissected, and ultimately resolved. Mrs. Hudson had prepared dinner, an excellent joint with all the trimmings, for she had a way of knowing when we needed the comfort of good, solid English cooking, and we had eaten in comfortable silence, each of us processing in our own way the events of the past days. The fire burned low in the grate, casting dancing shadows on the walls and ceiling. Holmes had taken up his position in his favourite chair, his long legs stretched toward the warmth, his fingers steepled beneath his chin in that attitude of contemplation I knew so well. I had drawn my own chair near and was making notes for the account I planned to write, though I knew already that certain details would need to be obscured or altered to protect the privacy of those involved. After a long silence, I ventured a comment that had been forming in my mind throughout the day. There was something almost Gothic in the affair, I said, choosing my words carefully. The whispering steps, the family dread, the supernatural atmosphere. It had all the elements of one of those sensation novels that are so popular now. Holmes shrugged, a slight movement of his shoulders, and reached for the coffee pot that stood on the table between us. He poured carefully, watching the dark liquid stream into the cup with that focused attention he brought to even the smallest physical tasks. The coffee's surface caught the firelight, showing tiny eddies and currents as the liquid settled. "Gothic effects," said he, lifting his cup and regarding those swirling patterns as if they held some answer to a question I had not asked, "are produced not by ghosts, but by craftsmen. A reed, a tube, a patient knife beneath a tread, a man in debt, and the ancient appetite of fear. That is your abbey ruin and midnight bell together, Watson. Strip away the atmosphere, the shadows, the suggestions of the supernatural agency, and what remains? Mechanics and psychology, nothing more. When blood remembers, my dear fellow, it is usually remembering a bill." I smiled at that, recognizing the characteristic reduction of the mysterious to the mundane that was Holmes's particular genius. Yet I found myself thinking that there was something he was not saying, something he was leaving out of his analysis. For all his talk of mechanics and craftsmanship, there had been real evil in that cellar, real malice in the patient construction of that whispering machine. The Gothic atmosphere had not been an illusion, but a recognition, however distorted by fear and suggestion, of genuine human wickedness. And yet, I said slowly, Lionel Wyndham's crime was Gothic in its essence, was it not? The patience of it, the willingness to terrorize his own family for weeks, to risk their sanity as well as their lives. There is something medieval in such cruelty, something that belongs more to the torture chamber than to the modern world. Holmes was silent for a moment, his eyes distant, his coffee forgotten in his hand. When he spoke again, his voice had lost some of its certainty, taking on a more reflective quality. "Perhaps you are right, Watson. Perhaps I am too quick to dismiss the genuinely uncanny quality of human evil when it is directed with intelligence and care. Lionel Wyndham was not a brute or a savage. He was an educated man, a gentleman by birth and breeding who chose to become a torturer of women. That transformation, from human to something less than human, perhaps that is the true Gothic element in our case. Not the whispering stair, but the whisper in Lionel's own mind that told him such actions were justified, that his needs outweighed their peace, that their fear was an acceptable price for his comfort." He set down his cup with a sharp click, as if dismissing the line of thought as too philosophical for his taste. "But such speculations are for moralists and poets, my dear fellow. I am merely a detector of crime, a reader of evidence. I leave the larger questions of human nature to those better equipped to answer them, which is to say, to you, when you write up this case for your chronicles." I accepted the deflection with good grace, knowing that Holmes was uncomfortable with discussions that ventured too far into the realm of ethics and emotion. Yet I also knew, and I believe he knew, that his work was fundamentally moral in nature, that his devotion to truth and justice was as much a matter of conviction as of intellect. He might speak of detection as a science, as a pure exercise of logic, but his choice of clients, his refusal of certain cases, his occasional mercy toward those whose crimes sprang from desperation rather than malice, all these revealed a man guided by principles he would not name, but which governed his actions nonetheless. We sat in silence then, each occupied with his own thoughts, as the fire burned down to embers and the sounds of Baker Street gradually quieted. Somewhere a clock chimed 10, then past. Mrs. Hudson passed through the hall below, and I heard her bolt the front door and bank the stove. The ordinary rituals of an ordinary evening, yet made precious by the knowledge of what lay behind us, the solved mystery, the defeated evil, the restored peace. Before we retired, I asked Holmes one final question that had been nagging at me. The pawn tickets. Will Lady Eugenia be able to recover the necklace? Already arranged, Holmes replied with a small smile. I called upon the pawnbroker this afternoon and redeemed the item in question. Lady Eugenia will have it back tomorrow, along with a recommendation for a jeweller who can assess its true value and perhaps restore it to its original glory. Whether the stones are paste or genuine, the setting deserves to be appreciated rather than pawned. It was a typical Holmes touch, the practical detail attended to, the loose end tied off, the small kindness performed without fanfare or expectation of gratitude. I smiled and bid him good night, retiring to my own room with the satisfaction of knowing that another case had been brought to its proper conclusion, another wrong righted, another darkness dispelled by the clear light of reason. So ended the case of the Whispering Stair, leaving behind it a house no longer inclined to talk, and a lady who, finding herself unburdened of superstition, discovered that she had been brave all along. The mechanism was destroyed, as Holmes had promised. I watched him personally smash the reed and burn the bellows in our Baker Street fireplace, sending the ghost-making machine up in smoke like the fraud it had always been. The channels in the stair were sealed by honest carpenters who shook their heads at the unnecessary hollows they found. And Lionel Wyndham was tried, convicted, and transported, his name struck from the family records and his face erased from the portrait gallery, as if he had never been. Lady Eugenia wrote to us once, some months later, to say that she had taken a lease on a cottage in the country, and was considering whether to sell Wyndham House or let it to tenants. The stairs, she noted, with something that might have been humour, had been completely rebuilt, and were now the most solid in London. Miss Fairbrook had married the Reverend Mr. Morley, whose interest in her studies had ripened into something warmer, and they were very happy. Palfrey remained as steward, supervising the renovations with the pride of a man whose competence had been publicly affirmed. As for Holmes and myself, we returned to our familiar rhythms, the morning papers, the stream of clients, the sudden departures on trains to country houses or coastal towns, the late-night vigils, and the triumphant resolutions. The Whispering Stair took its place in my notebooks alongside the Speckled Band and the Red-Headed League, another chapter in that long chronicle of detection and justice that was my privilege to record. And sometimes, On foggy evenings, when the gaslight made shadows dance on our walls and the old house creaked and settled around us, I would remember that whispering voice rising from the hollow stair, and I would be grateful for the solid, rational world that Holmes's methods revealed. A world where whispers had tongues, where mysteries had solutions, and where evil, however patient and clever, could always be defeated by reason, courage, and careful attention to the evidence of brass screws and peppermint breath. The Gothic shadows were only shadows after all. But the light that dispelled them, that was real and eternal and entirely human. It was some months later that I passed Bedford Square and saw the sun fall clean along the face of Wyndham House. The brass was bright on the knocker, the steps were not listening, and the old oak within, I fancy, had learned to keep its counsel. There are many evils in London, yet the worst of them seem lessened when one remembers that somewhere in Baker Street a man sits who has taught himself to hear truth in the mere grain of wood. Holmes, when I told him my reflection, only smiled. No, when a house whispers, my dear fellow, first look for the mouth. If this tale captured you, I invite you to subscribe for more untold cases of Sherlock Holmes, and tell us in the comments where you're listening from. Until the next case, keep your lamp burning, and beware the fog.